The planet lay in silence, a graveyard of a once thriving civilization. Thick, ash-filled clouds choked the sky, casting a permanent shadow over what was left of the surface. Towers that once touched the heavens were now twisted ruins, jagged shards of metal and stone piercing through a landscape of destruction. There were no sounds of life, just the cold wind, blowing dust across the desolation. The ground was cracked and scorched, no longer capable of supporting even the smallest hint of green. It was as though the planet itself had given up, resigned to a slow, inevitable death. Among the ruins, small figures scurried through the debris. The children, thin and sickly, moved with the jerky desperation of creatures too young to understand the full weight of their circumstances, but old enough to know that no one was coming to help them. Their eyes, wide and haunted, darted from one shadow to the next, constantly searching for food or shelter, though neither seemed to exist anymore. Their tiny hands, calloused and bruised, sifted through piles of rubble, hoping to find anything edible, a scrap of dried food, a canister of water. But hope was in short supply. Their species, known for its peaceful nature, had been caught in the crossfire of a war they had no part in. When the fleets of the warring factions clashed in the skies above their home, the bombs rained down indiscriminately. No one cared about the soft-spoken diplomats, or the families hiding in their homes. To the larger powers, they were an unfortunate casualty, collateral damage in a fight for resources and control. In a matter of days, their cities were leveled, their people slaughtered, and their culture erased from the stars. The few survivors, children too young to fight, too weak to flee, were left behind, stranded on a world that was no longer theirs. The galaxy turned its back on them. Broadcasts from the Galactic core showed cold, dispassionate alien leaders discussing the situation. The planet, they said, was a lost cause. Resources were too limited to be wasted on a handful of orphans from a species that no longer existed. The children were deemed non-essential. There would be no relief efforts, no ships sent to rescue them. The cost was too high, they argued. Better to let nature take its course. Apathy spread across the galaxy like a plague. Diplomatic broadcasts buzzed with terms like efficiency and resource management, as alien politicians debated the merits of leaving the children to their fate. Some even claimed it was a mercy, sparing the galaxy from the burden of another war-torn refugee crisis. They spoke with the detached precision of bureaucrats, as if discussing numbers on a ledger, not lives left to perish. Meanwhile, the children continued to starve. But not everyone could ignore the suffering. Aboard a battered human freighter, far from the halls of power, the crew huddled around a crackling broadcast. They had picked up a transmission from one of the galactic networks, detailing the situation on the dying planet. Faces that had once been hardened by years of space travel and battle now softened with a mixture of anger and disbelief. The captain, a grizzled man with more scars than smooth skin, watched in silence as the alien politicians talked about non-essential casualties. Non-essential, he muttered under his breath, disgust twisting his features. He knew what it meant. He had seen it before. The galaxy, with all its rules and regulations, always found ways to justify letting the weak die. But he wasn't about to stand by and let that happen. Not this time. The rest of the crew looked to him. They were veterans, men and women who had been through hell and back, but something about this broadcast hit them differently. They had all been out on the fringes of the galaxy long enough to know the truth about official decisions. The so-called leaders were too far removed from the reality of the frontier, too comfortable in their cushy chairs to care about the lives they condemned from afar. "Captain," one of the crew members said cautiously, "the orders are clear. We're not supposed to get involved." The captain's jaw clenched. "Damn the orders," he snapped, slamming his fist against the console. "We're not leaving those kids to die." There was a murmur of agreement among the crew. They knew the risks. Disobeying a direct order could cost them their careers, maybe even their lives. But the idea of sitting back while children, innocent children, were abandoned by the very people sworn to protect them was too much to bear. The decision was made without another word. They were going in. As they prepared the ship for descent, the tension on board was palpable. This wasn't just another mission. They weren't just fighting for survival or a paycheck. They were about to defy the galaxy itself, to stand up against the indifference of the powerful and protect the lives that everyone else had deemed expendable. The captain stood at the helm, his gaze fixed on the decaying planet below. His fingers hovered over the controls, his mind racing through the potential consequences. They would be labeled as outlaws, hunted by their own people, and despised by the alien council. But none of that mattered right now. What mattered were the children. The ones left behind. The ones the galaxy had forgotten. He took a deep breath and pressed the button, initiating the landing sequence. The ship began its descent, cutting through the ash-filled skies like a blade through smoke. Below, the orphans continued their silent struggle, unaware that for the first time in weeks, someone was coming for them. The captain's voice, low but firm, echoed through the ship's comm system. "Prepare for landing. Let's bring those kids home." The ship touched down in a barren, charred landscape, the ground cracking beneath its weight as it settled into the thick ash. The landing bay doors opened, revealing the chaos outside. Acidic rain hissed as it hit the metal of the ship, and the wind whipped around violently, carrying with it the scent of rot and decay. The atmosphere was toxic, heavy with a mix of chemicals and the lingering stench of death. The crew immediately donned their protective gear, faces hidden behind visors and breathing apparatuses as they stepped out into the wasteland. The terrain was unforgiving. Towering skeletal remains of once grand buildings loomed over them, casting long, distorted shadows across the scorched earth. Pools of acidic water bubbled in craters, remnants of the destruction that had obliterated the planet. Every step felt like walking through a graveyard, the air thick with the weight of all that had been lost. The humans moved carefully, knowing that the planet itself could kill them as quickly as any enemy. The captain's voice crackled through the comms, calm but urgent. "Stay close. Scanners are picking up faint life signs a few clicks ahead. But it's scattered, don't expect a clear path." The crew spread out, sweeping the area with handheld scanners designed to cut through the thick haze of radiation and toxins that filled the air. The devices beeped sporadically, picking up blips of life signs, weak, barely registering, but there. It was enough to keep them moving forward. As they pushed deeper into the ruins, the grim reality of what had happened here became impossible to ignore. Bodies, small, frail, were scattered along the streets, some partially buried under rubble, others exposed to the elements. The children's clothes, once brightly colored, were now charred and tattered. The humans didn't speak, but their faces behind their masks told the story. This was worse than they had imagined. The galaxy had truly left these orphans to die, and it showed in every corner of this forsaken city. The medic knelt beside one of the bodies, her gloved hand gently brushing ash away from a small, outstretched hand. She didn't say anything, just bowed her head for a moment before moving on. They couldn't afford to stop. Not yet. The ones who still clung to life were their priority. After what felt like an eternity, they reached the ruins of a once mighty structure, now little more than a pile of rubble and twisted steel. The scanner beeped more insistently. The crew paused, adjusting their equipment. The captain pointed toward a collapsed section of the building where the signal was strongest. "They're in there," he said quietly. "We need to get them out." Carefully, the crew moved the debris, every movement cautious, so as not to trigger a collapse. They worked methodically, until finally, the outline of a small figure emerged from the shadows. A child, huddled behind what remained of a wall, eyes wide and unblinking, stared at them. Filthy, gaunt, and trembling, the child flinched as the humans approached. The crew stopped in their tracks, unsure of how to proceed. These children had only known fear, abandonment, and death. To them, anyone approaching could be a threat. The medic, heart heavy, stepped forward, lowering her weapon and slowly taking off her mask. Her face, though weary, was kind. She knelt down, holding out her hands, palms up, a gesture of peace. She spoke softly, trying to bridge the language gap with what little she knew of their tongue. Her words were halting, but sincere. "It's okay. We're here to help." The child didn't move at first, but their eyes shifted to the ration pack the medic placed on the ground. Food. Water. The most basic necessities, offered without strings. The medic smiled, the warmth of her expression a stark contrast to the cold, dead world around them. Slowly, painfully, the child inched forward. Tiny hands reached out, grasping the food with trembling fingers. It was a small victory, but it was a start. Soon, other children emerged from the rubble, drawn by the sight of their fellow orphan being cared for. There were only a handful left, sickly, hollow-eyed, their trust shattered, but they were alive. And for the first time in what felt like ages, they had a glimmer of hope. The crew moved quickly, distributing supplies, tending to wounds, offering warmth through blankets and gentle words. The children were still wary, their trauma evident in every glance and flinch, but they didn't resist. They were too tired, too hungry, too broken to do anything but accept the kindness being offered. The medic stayed close to them, speaking softly, trying to make them feel safe. She didn't push too hard, just let them come to her on their terms. One of the older children, maybe 10 or 11 in human years, looked up at her with eyes that had seen too much. She met his gaze, and in that moment, something passed between them, an understanding that went beyond words. The boy, after a long silence, reached out and took her hand. The bond had been made. Just as the crew started preparing to move the children back to the ship, a sharp beep cut through the comms, followed by a warning flash on the scanners. Hostile life forms detected, closing in fast. The captain's face hardened as he looked at the readouts. "Patrols inbound," he muttered. "They must have picked up our landing." The crew sprang into action, securing the children as quickly as they could. The medic's calm exterior didn't waver, but her movements were quicker, more precise. The children, sensing the urgency, stayed close to her, trusting her now more than their surroundings. The captain's voice cut through the chaos. "We need to move. Now." They hurried back through the ruins, navigating the treacherous terrain as fast as they dared with the children in tow. The distant sound of engines grew louder, the unmistakable hum of alien ships drawing closer. Time was running out. The race to escape had begun. As the crew hurried to load the children onto the ship, the low hum of alien engines grew into a thunderous roar. Dust and ash swirled as the patrol ships descended, sleek and ominous, their lights cutting through the haze like knives. The humans knew what this meant. They had been found. The patrol, representatives of the very faction that had orchestrated the destruction of the children's home, had arrived to finish the job. These soldiers weren't here for negotiation. They were here to eliminate any trace of the orphans, ensuring no loose ends remained. The crew braced themselves as the patrol disembarked, armored figures emerging from the ships, weapons raised and ready. Their leader, a tall, imposing alien with cold, unblinking eyes, stepped forward. There was no pretense of diplomacy. His voice, filtered through a translation device, cut through the air like a blade. "Step aside," he commanded, his tone devoid of emotion. "These orphans are a matter of galactic security. Your interference is unlawful." The captain, standing firm in front of the orphans, narrowed his eyes. He could see the fear in the children's faces behind him, could feel the tension in his own crew. But retreat wasn't an option. Not now. Not after everything they had been through to get this far. He tightened his grip on his sidearm, but his voice was steady when he replied. "We're not leaving these kids to die," the captain said. "You'll have to go through us first." The alien patrol leader's eyes flicked over the humans, calculating. They were clearly outnumbered and outgunned, yet the humans didn't waver. After a moment of silence, the alien nodded to his soldiers. "So be it." Blaster fire erupted, bright flashes lighting up the ashen sky. The crew dove for cover, shielding the orphans behind the wreckage of the city's ruins. The patrol was relentless, their advanced weaponry far superior to the humans' limited arsenal. But what the humans lacked in firepower, they made up for in cunning. The captain barked orders, his voice calm under pressure. "Use the terrain. We need to stall them long enough to get these kids out of here." The crew sprang into action, improvising with whatever they could find. They rigged traps with debris, used the narrow alleyways of the ruined city to force the patrol into choke points, and utilized the cover of the ash-filled atmosphere to obscure their movements. One of the crew members, a former engineer, hacked into a nearby power grid, causing an explosion that sent a patrol ship crashing into the ground. The humans were no strangers to fighting against the odds, and in this moment, their ingenuity shone through. For every inch the patrol advanced, the humans made them pay for it. Still, it was clear they couldn't hold out forever. The orphans clung to each other, their eyes wide with terror as the battle raged around them. But the medic, crouched beside them, kept whispering reassurances, her hands steady despite the chaos. "We're getting you out of here," she promised. "Just hold on a little longer." Finally, as the tide of the battle threatened to overwhelm them, the crew's signal officer shouted over the comms. "Captain? We've got a clear path to the ship. We need to move now." With the patrol momentarily pinned down, the captain gave the order. "Fall back. Get the kids to the ship." The crew moved swiftly, gathering the children and sprinting toward the waiting ship as blaster fire continued to rain down around them. The captain and a few others held the line, covering the retreat until the last child was safely aboard. Then, in a desperate dash, they followed, narrowly escaping as another patrol ship strafed the ground where they had stood moments before. Inside the freighter, the engines roared to life, and the ship blasted off, breaking through the planet's toxic atmosphere just as the alien patrol regrouped below. The humans had made it, but just barely. As the ship soared through the void, leaving the dying planet behind, the crew allowed themselves a brief moment of relief. But it didn't last long. They knew the battle wasn't over. The alien patrol wouldn't stop hunting them, and soon enough, they'd have to face another enemy, their own government. News had already spread. Broadcasts from Earth were flooding the ship's communication systems, showing politicians and military officials discussing the crew's unauthorized mission. Their faces were grim, the tone cold. The media painted the crew as reckless, their actions a dangerous defiance of galactic law. The very leaders who had once praised humanity's compassion now framed their decision to rescue the orphans as a mistake, an emotional response that risked political fallout. "They've branded us as outlaws," one of the crew muttered bitterly as the broadcasts played on a screen. "They're more worried about keeping the peace with the Galactic Council than saving lives." The tension inside the ship grew. Some of the crew members, who had been so resolute during the mission, now began to waver. They had risked everything, defied direct orders, fought against a powerful alien faction, and now they faced the possibility of never being able to return home. The weight of their actions hung heavy over them. "We did the right thing," the captain said, his voice firm but weary. "These kids were left to die. We couldn't just stand by and let it happen." "But at what cost?" one of the crew members asked. "We're fugitives now. If the government doesn't hand us over to the council, they'll lock us up themselves. We've put everything on the line for this." The medic, still sitting with the orphans, looked up. Her face was tired, but there was a fire in her eyes. "These kids are alive because of us. That's worth whatever comes next." The crew fell into silence, the enormity of their situation sinking in. They had saved the children, but now they were on the run, not just from the alien patrol, but from their own people. The captain made the call. "We can't go back to Earth. Not yet. We'll find a neutral planet, somewhere outside of galactic jurisdiction, and seek asylum. We'll keep these kids safe, no matter what it takes." As the ship hurtled through space, the crew prepared for the next phase of their journey. They didn't know what awaited them, or if they would ever find safety, but one thing was certain: they had chosen to stand up for what was right. And no matter the consequences, they would see it through to the end. The ship glided into orbit around a planet on the edge of galactic jurisdiction. From above, the world looked promising: lush forests, clear blue waters, and no immediate signs of hostile life. It was a neutral zone, unclaimed by any major galactic faction, a potential sanctuary where they could hide, at least for a while. The crew had been cautious, but after weeks of running, they were desperate for rest, and the orphans needed a stable environment. As the humans and children disembarked, The fresh air and natural surroundings were a stark contrast to the desolation they had left behind. The crew moved quickly to set up a temporary camp, doing their best to shield the orphans from any potential dangers. The children, though still scarred from their ordeal, began to explore the new environment with hesitant curiosity. It was the first time they had felt anything close to peace since their world had fallen. But peace, as the humans knew all too well, was fleeting. A few days into their stay, the captain received a transmission from a local faction leader, offering to negotiate protection for the crew and the orphans in exchange for resources and technological assistance. The offer seemed too good to be true, but they had little choice. They needed allies if they were to survive. The meeting was tense but seemed to go well. The faction leader promised support, and, in exchange, the crew offered what little they could. It felt like they had finally found a place to rest, at least temporarily. Yet trust was a fragile thing, and their hopes were soon shattered. Hours after the meeting, alarms blared across the camp. Scanners picked up the approach of ships, alien ships, the same faction that had been hunting them since the beginning. The local faction had betrayed them, informing the Galactic Council in exchange for a reward. The humans and orphans had been sold out, and now, the enemy was closing in. The crew scrambled into action, fortifying their position and preparing for another inevitable battle. They knew they couldn't hold off the incoming forces for long, not without reinforcements or superior firepower. The children, now understanding the danger, huddled together, fear gripping them as the sounds of approaching engines filled the air. The medic crouched beside the orphans, whispering reassurances she wasn't sure she could keep. But just as the situation seemed hopeless, something changed. The oldest of the orphans, the boy who had first taken the medic's hand, stepped forward. His eyes, no longer filled with fear, now glowed with a strange, unfamiliar light. The other children followed, their gazes sharp and focused. There was something different about them, something the humans hadn't seen before. Suddenly, the air around the children shimmered. An invisible force pulsed outward, causing the approaching ships to shudder in midair. The crew watched in shock as the alien vessels veered off course, their systems malfunctioning as the orphans, through some latent psychic ability or advanced technology embedded within their biology, manipulated the environment. The once helpless children were no longer defenseless. They had a power of their own, one they had likely not even known existed until now. The humans quickly realized that these children were not just survivors, they were the future of their species. With the right guidance and time, they could grow into something far more powerful than anyone had anticipated. The captain, though stunned, saw the opportunity in this moment. He gathered the crew. "These kids, whatever they just did, it's a game changer," he said. "We didn't just save a handful of orphans. We saved a species that has the potential to change everything." The battle was not over, but with the children's newfound abilities, they managed to fend off the immediate threat. The alien ships were forced to retreat, their systems crippled by the orphans' powers. For now, they were safe, but it was clear that the galaxy wouldn't stop hunting them. The captain knew they needed to keep moving, to find a new place where the children could be safe, and where they could learn to control their abilities. As the humans and orphans gathered in the aftermath, the bond between them had never been stronger. The children, once terrified and alone, now looked to the humans not just as rescuers, but as family. The medic, in particular, had become a maternal figure to many of them, her compassion and care something they had never known before. She knelt beside the boy who had first shown his power, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You're stronger than you know," she said softly. "But you don't have to do this alone. We're with you, all the way." The boy nodded, his eyes filled with a determination that belied his age. "We'll rebuild," he said, his voice steady. "We'll make sure what happened to us never happens again." The crew shared a look, knowing that their mission had changed. What had started as a desperate rescue had evolved into something far greater. These children were the key to a new future, one that could reshape the balance of power in the galaxy. But for now, their priority was survival. The captain turned to the crew. "We'll find a new place, somewhere the council can't touch us. Somewhere these kids can grow and become what they're meant to be." As the ship lifted off from the planet, the crew and the children huddled together, staring out at the vastness of space. They were still fugitives, still hunted, but they had something no one else in the galaxy had: hope. And they had each other. The galaxy remained indifferent, its political machinery still grinding away, oblivious to the small band of humans and alien children on the run. But even in the face of such indifference, humanity had proven something. They had shown the galaxy that compassion, courage, and the willingness to fight for what was right could defy even the coldest logic of power. As the ship sped toward the stars, the future was uncertain, but it was filled with possibility. The humans had saved the orphans, and in doing so, they had sparked the beginnings of something far bigger than any of them could have imagined. Together, they would face whatever came next, knowing that no matter the odds, they had chosen the right path. And for the first time in a long while, the orphans felt something stir within them, hope for a new beginning.